Chapter 2. Lady Walsh's request did make a trip downtown a necessity, but the day was so fine I decided to take the trolley. A few old ladies in the back seats frowned my way as I stood with the men at the front of the car, reminding me that I was still in my skirts. If I had dressed in my native costume of bucks, they wouldn't have given me a second glance. The men, mostly young clerks and old gophers who couldn't afford to keep their own carry, collectively ignored me. A woman who didn't assume her proper place in public effectively rendered herself invisible to the Tonners and anyone who emulated them, which were most of the respectable citizens of Rumson. Rena called it wishful blindness. As we passed through one of the old quarters, a funeral procession halted the trolley, and as the black-shrouded cart and carriage passed, I saw a glimmering form drifting after them. The ghost of the deceased, I guessed. I often caught glimpses of such spectres following the newly dead, or hovering about a fresh grave. When I tried to go near them, they faded from sight. I knew from experience that they weren't creatures of magic. While mages insisted the proper spell or ritual could bring back the spirits of the dead, I'd found enough noise-making contraptions hidden in seance chambers to explain such convenient visitations. I had no explanation for what I sometimes saw, but I suspected they might be a trace of the spirit left behind by those who passed on, like the scent of a lady's perfume that lingered in a room for a time after her departure, or the outlines of a face in an old, sun-faded portent. Mum would have insisted that they were fantasies of the imagination, nothing more. I often wondered how she'd explain away the chill they left in the air once they vanished. At Pike Street I got off and walked to an alley between a boarding house and a dressmaker's shop. The alley was famous for one thing. It was the lowest point in the city. It also had flooded every year during the storm season, until one Mrs. Karina Eagle had purchased the boarding house, and hired a road crew to dig up trenches on either side for drainage pipes. As for the boarding house, where no one ever boarded for longer than a night, it still bore the sign, Mrs. Holcomb's Rooms to Let, but everyone knew it as the Eagle's Nest. I stopped in front of a bruiser in a pilled tweed coat, who had one shoulder propped against a corner. He was reading over a short sheet without much interest and rubbing a flat, milky white stone between his broad thumb and the stump of his first finger. I waited politely until he had finished reading and looked up at me. "Morning, Wrecker." "Ms. Kit?" He touched the brim of his cap. "She's not up yet. Late night she had, what with all of 'em sailors what came into port yesterday." Wrecker had been sent over to Toriana on work release from Sydney a few years back, after serving 10 years in the quarries for kneecapping the wrong chap. He had finished up his debt to the Crown, and now lived as a freedman. Had Rena not hired him, he might have kept at the work he knew best. Luckily, protecting her and her gals required Wreck to commit far fewer felonies. "No worries, I'll bring her a cup." Knowing my long-standing relationship with his mistress, he nodded and let me pass. At the other end of the alley was the back of the boarding house, a red door, and a bright brass bell. After I tugged on the pull, a narrow-eyed slot appeared in the door. "Miss Kittredge, to see Mrs. Eagle." The door opened, and a fellow almost as huge as Wrecker inspected me. He was new, which meant his predecessor was either dead or in prison. "Sellin' or buyin'?" The way he ogled my body from the neck down made it clear he hoped I was selling. "Neither," I said firmly. "I'm a friend." He pouted a little. "Her's still abed." "So I've been told." I went past him and made my way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Eagle's cook stood cracking eggs in a large mix pot with one hand and flipping rashers with the other. "Morning, Elmira," I asked, nipping a piece of bacon from a platter and dodging a swat from her spatula. "Have you sent up her tea?" "Why would I? She left word not to be disturbed before noon." Elmira nodded toward the kettle. "If I were you, I'd drop a pinch in a pinch of willow bark." I winced. "Rough trade last night?" "Mariners from the first shore leave since the skirmish." She pulled a whisk from her apron pocket and began beating the eggs. "Randy boys, the lot of 'em." I made up a tray and took it in to the back stairs, where I carried it up one flight to the mistress's chambers. Walking into Mrs. Eagle's private sanctuary was like crossing the threshold to a dark church. A cool rush of shadows and incense-scented air. I made my way to the cart carefully, and after depositing the tray, I lit the wall lamp and turned to the bed. "For the love of Jesu," a muffled voice said from beneath a mound of golden silk puffs. "Piss off." I poured and carried a cup of tea over to the mound. "You know this is why your mother wanted you to be a nun." Too hard on the knees. A small head of tousled blonde hair appeared, and a slender hand took the cup from me. "What do you want? And sweet Mary, don't say anything that involves my bum in motion, or I'll thump you." "As ever tempted as I am by your charms," I sat down on the edge of the mound. "I came for a gown." She waved a hand toward her armoire of indecently beautiful negligee and guzzled the tea. "Take whatever you want and be gone with you." "Not that sort of gown." She pushed a handful of hair out of her eyes to give an irate squint. "You said you were done working the hill." "Special exception. Just this one time," I promised. "Someone's taken the cut direct to a new and nasty level." She yawned. "How nasty?" "Slicing hateful words into her skin while she sleeps." I touched a whisker burn on her cheek. "Does that sound like anyone you've thrown out lately?" "Chastity had a biter last month. Horrid man. I'd reck relieve him of his front teeth before showing him out." She sat up and held out her cup. "More." I poured her tea and waited for as my friend gradually roused. Without her jewels and cosmetics, Karina Eagle looked too young to be let out on her own. She had been, once upon a time, long before she had become the queen of the backstreet brothels. We'd found each other, Rena and I, drawn together as fellow outcasts in a society that wanted nothing to do with either of us. I'd had it a bit easier, coming to Rumson as a penniless, nameless waif who'd had as much chance at being respectable as a hemp-picker had at residing on the hill. Rena's family had been a merchant class, indecently successful, and had enjoyed their hard-earned riches in hopes of marrying her off to better. The hard-fisted gambler they'd snagged had strung them along while gaming away her bride price. When the bleeding sod had wagered Rena's maiden night in a card game and lost, she'd been forced to pay the debt. The morning after, the vicious bastard had refused to marry her, claiming publicly that she was bespoiled goods, which conveniently cancelled his financial and social obligations to their family. Rena had been ruined, of course, and turned out onto the streets. I'd met Rena shortly after that, when she'd still been green enough to let herself be cornered. Stopping the brood I'd found beating her half to death in a back alley had required only a brick to the back of the head. The real task had been convincing her to come home with me so I could fix her up. She'd stayed with me for a few days, but as soon as she had mostly healed, she left and went back on the stroll. Since then, I'd tried to persuade her to give up the business, but the money had always been too good, and the trade too steady. Because Rena was young, beautiful, and posh enough to attract a better sort, she'd quickly built a list of generous regulars. They had funded the purchase of her house of ill repute, which in turn provided shelter and protection for the lost girls my friend regularly picked from the streets. For those too young to know what they were about, Rena even found decent employment. Her success had made her notorious, but Rena took great pleasure in being the most scandalous female in Rumson, and still banked more money in 1 month than I did in a year. My friend finally emerged from her bed and tottered to the lamps to light a few more. The old, threadbare flannel gown she wore made me stifle a chuckle. It bore no resemblance to the lacy, gauzy negligee she wore when entertaining her clients. "All right." Rena fell into an armchair and propped her brow against her hand. "Tell me who it is." "Nolan Walsh's wife." "Lady Diana." She exhaled heavily. "You've picked yourself a right one there. She'd be the eldest girl of one of the Landau brothers." I thought through all the scandals I knew that involved the Landaus. The one who gambled, or the one who drank? "The investor. Lost everything in mine speculation." She winced. "William, or Wilson, or something like that. In any case, he tugged the old-school tie, sold her off. Pretty little thing, but no spine at all. You know she cried at the wedding?" Rena faithfully attended every society wedding open to the public, always arriving heavily veiled and dressed in widow's weeds. She claimed it was to drum up trade, as virginal brides always sent their newly-wed husbands looking for satisfaction elsewhere. But I knew better. Rena had a passion for watching ceremonies and rituals, the grander the better. In a strange way, they seemed to comfort her. Would Walsh have a hand in this? Men who secretly abused their wives disgusted me. But there was always a possibility that the banker had acquired a taste for hurting women, or perhaps had his sights set on a third wife. "Doubtful. He shows her off too much. He'd never rip up a brand-new waistcoat and then wear it after." Rena smothered a yawn. My money's on the son. Jealous? Diseased. Sent home from Oxford after a bad case of the drips. She said it with a strumpet's satisfied relish. Married 5 years now, but no children. I sat back, since he'd only otherwise had 2 daughters. Oh, so that's why he married her. And why he took her so young, Rena agreed. Walsh has a pretty good 20, 30 more years on his earth. Plenty of time to do the deed and then some. But why are you taking this job, Kit? You know how it'll end. She thinks she's been cursed, I said softly. Rena humphed. If anyone's under an evil spell, it's you. She stood and stretched. When do you call on her? Today, for tea. I'm a newfound poor cousin. I thought for a minute. I need something in springed muslin, genteel cut, but no sashing. Lace. A very little lace. Already thinking? Rena nodded. Yellowed or shabby? Yellowed. I'm a working lass. I followed her into an adjoining room, which was filled with freestanding racks of gowns. Rena had once made a vow never to wear the same gown more than twice, and after making a mutually satisfactory arrangement with her neighbour, the spinster dressmaker, she had managed to keep it. I did a garden party a few years ago, she said as she sorted through one rack. Old gent wanted all of us dressed up like Debs, had each of us sit on his lap so he could fondle us while we fed him biscuits and called him Daddums. I hid my revulsion. I can't wear white. No one can, love. She winked as she extracted one gown, held it up to me, and then exchanged it for another. If you don't start carrying a shade when you go out, you'll be as dark as a shaman. She switched the gown for a third and nodded. This'll do for tea. I glanced down. It's pink. And I despise pink. It's baby's blush. It makes you look like a proper lass. Turn round. When I did, she held the yoke of the bodice to my shoulders. If I snip out the pads, it should fit. She tugged at the chain round my neck. Can't wear this. I'll tuck it under. I only took off my pendant when I bathed, and even then I kept it within reach. I'd promised my mum I always would. Slippers. She bent to retrieve a pair from a box beneath the gown and handed them to me. They're too big, and even pinker than the gown. Stuff the shoes with paper. Satchel. She found and placed a fringed drawstring reticule on top of the slippers. Crinoline. No, I said flatly. Kit. They itch and they make me sweat, I told her. I'd rather go naked. She glared at me. Then it'll have to be 3 petticoats. When I opened my mouth, she tapped my cheek sharply. This is not open for discussion, you silly twit. You're going to the hill. You know the butler will be counting them before he lets you through the door. Showing up, underdressed, is as smart as standing in the marketplace and shouting you become an agent for the crown. I'd hang myself first. She was right. I hate being female. Well, until you spout a beard and a cock, there you are. She patted my shoulder. Come on, while you're here I might as well feed you. I left the hateful pink gown and accoutrements in Rena's bedchamber as she dressed, and then followed her down into the kitchen, where Elmira had 2 steaming plates of eggs, bacon, and fry bread waiting for us. Someone's worked a charm on poor Liv, the cook told Rena. She says she can't feel her bum. Rena sat down and dug into her food. That's because she sits on it too much. I smacked her bare with a swift myself to test it. Drew blood, but she didn't even flinch. Elmira glanced at me. Someone might make herself useful while she's dawdling here. My eggs will get cold, I complained. She whisked my plate out from under my fork. I'll keep them on the stove. I turned to Rena, who shrugged. All right. Where's poor Liv? Purple door, 3rd floor. The cook beamed at me. You're a good lass, Kit. I'm a deprived lass. I'm a starving lass. I tromped back up the stairs to the 3rd floor, found Liv's purple door, and knocked on it. Liv, it's Kit, Mrs. Eagle's friend from uptown. Let me in. I heard breathing, and then 2 strangled words. I can't. I propped a hand against the doorframe. Why not? More breathing, and choking. Can't move. I tried the knob, which jammed first and then opened. Inside I found Liv, wide-eyed and naked on the floorboards. I knelt beside her. What's all this, then? Magic, she gasped, as if she were having trouble taking in air. Killing me. I looked her over, reached down, and slapped her face. Come on, snap out of it. There's a good girl. She shook her head wildly, and then her eyes bulged as she gulped in a huge breath. "Oh, sweet Jesu!" She panted as if she'd been running for miles. "I couldn't breathe, I couldn't." She stared at the hand which she had lifted to her face and then at me. "How did you do that?" "I walloped you." I helped her up from the floor and wrapped her in a robe. "Sit before you fall down." When she did, I looked round her room. Aside from the usual female fripperies, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. "What have you been using?" "Nothing, I swear. Mistress doesn't allow it." Liv huddled in her robe. "Thank God you came, miss. I thought for sure I was going to die." I knelt down beside her bed, lifted the skirt, and looked under it. A small brown box lay among the drifts of dust, and when I pulled it out, Liv saw it and uttered a shriek. "It's just a box." I tugged open the string and poured the contents into my hands, which turned out to be 6 polished green stones. A box of rocks. "No," Liv whispered. "Someone put them there. Someone bespelled them to kill me. Take them away." Her voice rose to a screech. "Take them!" "They're rocks, Liv, not magic." As she shouted more nonsense at me, I went to the window and tossed them out. "There, they're gone. Stop screaming." Liv staggered to her feet and collapsed against me, giving me a trembling hug. "Thank you," she sobbed. "You saved me life." What was it about me that attracted so many tearful females? I didn't do anything. I set her at arm's length. "You should go see a physic today, though. You might have picked a bad spider's bite or something." She wrenched away and hurried over to her dresser. I have to leave the city. Right away, before they try again." "Stop by the physics first," I suggested, before I let myself out and returned downstairs. Rena had finished her breakfast and drank some juice as she watched me eat mine. "Well?" I swallowed a mouthful of bread. "Hysteria, or maybe a spider bite." I found a box of green rocks under her bed. "She's fine." I glanced at Rena. "She's also packing her bags." "Sorry." "Probably staged it. Lazy tart never could turn over more than 2 Johnnies a night." Rena didn't seem dismayed. "So much for her numb bum." "Thanks, Kit." "My pleasure." I noticed Elmira staring at me. "She'll be all right. I only gave her a little slap." "Greenstones are said to be spellbinders," the cook said. "That's rotten magic, Miss Kit." I exchanged an amused look with Rena. "Is there any other kind?"